There are places in America where people swear they aren't alone in the woods. Across Tennessee, Michigan, Virginia, upstate New York, and Utah's mountains, ordinary people have reported encounters with something enormous, something that shouldn't be there. Whether you believe in Bigfoot, another undiscovered animal, or something even stranger, these are the stories they can't explain. Tonight we're diving into 6 unsettling encounters from across the country. Dim the lights, settle in, and let's get into it. Something hit the porch and it wasn't falling from a tree. This story comes from sweet Lorelei. Lorelei and her husband had spent the entire week relaxing in a secluded cabin in eastern Tennessee, about 25 miles from Pigeon Forge. The cabin sat alone on 68 acres of mostly wooded land, tucked down a dirt road and surrounded by hiking trails and thick forest. Lorelei and her husband and their 2 children, ages 17 and 20, had enjoyed sitting on the porch every morning and every night. Their last evening there seemed no different. The weather was clear and cool, around 65 degrees. A single dim light glowed near the stairs leading off their porch. Their children had already gone inside for the night, leaving Lorelei and her husband alone in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the Tennessee woods. Then something slammed into the porch. At first, they assumed it was a pine cone falling from a tree. Neither of them thought much about it. About 20 minutes later, it happened again. Another sharp impact. This time they looked at each other. Then it happened a 3rd time, and then a 4th. Now Lorelei was confused. After going around the cabin, she realized something strange. There weren't any pine trees hanging over the roof or porch. There was no obvious reason pine cones should have been falling directly onto them. The sound seemed deliberate, almost as if something in the darkness was tossing them. Neither of them felt threatened. There was no overwhelming fear, no sense of danger, and nothing felt evil or ominous. Still, the feeling that they weren't alone became impossible to ignore. One possible explanation comes from Appalachian folklore. In these mountains, stories of the wood booger, the Appalachian version of Bigfoot, have been told for generations. Witnesses often claim these creatures throw rocks, sticks, and pine cones to warn people away from their territory. Some researchers even consider pine cones a less aggressive warning, a way of saying, "You're too close." Old mountain legends also speak of things that stay hidden in the woods, creatures and spirits that throw objects from the darkness to draw attention toward them. That's why many old-timers still repeat the same warning. If you hear something in the woods at night, no, you didn't. Skeptics offer other explanations: a flying squirrel high in the canopy, falling debris, or pine cones releasing as temperatures change could account for the sounds. But standing on a dark porch miles from town, with nothing visible beyond the tree line and no branches overhead, it's hard not to wonder. Because whatever was out there that night never showed itself. It only wanted them to know it was there. So please leave comments for Lorelei and let her know if you have any ideas. Something in the woods wouldn't stop whistling. The story was shared by Onion, but we're going to call him Owen just for the sake of the story. A few years ago, Owen was working for the Michigan Department of Natural Resources in the Sanilac area. After finishing a long day at work, he decided to pull over and take a walk to clear his head before heading home. He found an old trail along the side of a back road. It wasn't very well maintained, but it was easy enough to follow. For the first mile, everything felt normal. Summer bugs buzzed around him. The woods were quiet. Owen had his earbuds in about half volume, so he could still hear what was happening around him while he walked. Then he heard the whistling. There wasn't any pattern to it. Every few seconds, another whistle. Owen stopped and looked around. He was expecting to see another hiker somewhere on the trail, but nobody was there at all. He brushed it off and kept walking, but the whistling continued. And what bothered him most was that it never changed. It never sounded closer. It never sounded farther away. The sound just existed somewhere in the woods around him. Since Owen worked for the DNR, he had spent years outdoors. Strange sounds weren't unusual, and he tried to convince himself it was nothing. But then he walked into a clearing. The whistling suddenly stopped. The entire forest became unnaturally quiet. And at that exact moment, his phone shut off. The battery had been somewhere around 70%. There was no warning. The screen simply went black. He turned it back on and stood there trying to figure out what had happened. A minute later, the phone shut off again. He powered it back on one more time. And once again, after about a minute, it died. At that point, Owen only had about a half a mile left on the trail, and he decided it was time to leave. As he continued walking, the whistling came back. Still the exact same volume, still impossible to locate. And the strangest part was that he had never heard anything moving. No footsteps, no snapping sticks, no crunching leaves, nothing at all. The woods just seemed much quieter than they should have been. At first he wondered if maybe it was a poacher or a hunter trying to mess with him. He had dealt with people like that before while working for the DNR. But if someone had been following him through the woods, he should have heard them. The whistling continued until he reached his car. Once he drove away, his phone worked perfectly. No battery issues, no shutdowns, no problems during the entire drive home. Later, Owen even had the phone checked. The battery health was completely normal, and the device was still fairly new. The only thing he could compare it to is the way a phone shuts itself off when it's left in extreme heat or freezing temperatures, except the weather was normal. The trail was ordinary. Owen still can't explain the whistling that followed him through those woods. So what do you think was out there? What actually happened to Owen in the Sanilac woods? So if we look at theories, there are a few wild possibilities. There's always the Bigfoot connection. Owen wonders if Sasquatch was tracking him. Believers often report Bigfoot using eerie, unlocatable whistles to communicate or to intimidate people out of their territory. There's also the night whistle legend, which is deep woods folklore, which strictly warns never to whistle in the forest because it invites ancient spirits or entities known as mimics to follow you. Then we also have the dead zone theory, which is that sudden silence and his phone completely dying to point to a massive electromagnetic disturbance, something highly common in regional cryptid encounters. On the scientific side, it could have been a rogue bird, a human poacher pulling off a flawless, creepy prank. So was it a legendary beast, a forest spirit, or just a bizarre trick of nature? Let Owen know what you think in the comments. It was standing knee-deep in the water. The person who shared the story wanted to remain anonymous, so we're going to call him John. In September of 2012, John was working at a small water treatment facility in rural Virginia, where every morning started the same way. After starting up the plant, he'd walk about a quarter mile to inspect the reservoir. It was routine. He'd done it countless times before. But one morning around 5:30 a.m., something was different. The moon was still out, giving him just enough light to make out the walk without using his flashlight. As he approached the spillway, he noticed something standing in the water. At first, he assumed it was a person. The water there was about 2.5 to 3 feet deep, and whatever he was looking at was standing perfectly still. John is about 5'8", and he estimated the figure was about 6 feet tall, maybe a little taller, roughly the size of an NFL linebacker. The moon was behind them, making it impossible to make out any details. He couldn't tell if it had hair. He couldn't tell if it was male or female, or even what color it was. All he could see was its silhouette. He could see the water breaking around its legs. He could see its shadow stretching across the surface, and he could tell the water only came up to about its knees. Still believing it might be a person, John reached for his flashlight. By the time he switched it on, whatever had been standing in the spillway had already moved. It crossed roughly 15 feet through the darkness, climbed 4 or 5 feet up the bank, then stopped. It turned around. It looked directly at him, then calmly walked out of sight. That's when John realized it wasn't a person. He stood there for only a moment before turning around and walking back the way he'd come. After daylight, he drove back to the spillway, hoping to find tracks, signs of a person, or any evidence at all. There was nothing there. There was no one there, and he had no explanation. Over the years, though, other strange things happened around that reservoir. A local trapper once set beaver traps there, only to come back and find one ripped completely out of the ground and lying on the bank with no beaver anywhere around. On another occasion, turtle traps and catfish jugs disappeared. One of the few remaining jugs had somehow ended up on the bank. John also placed crawfish traps in a nearby creek. When he returned, one looked as though something had stepped directly on it and crushed it. The other had been pulled from the water, opened, and left on the bank. John isn't saying he saw Bigfoot. In fact, he says he has no idea what he saw. But if it wasn't a person, what was it? Some people in Appalachia would point to the wood booger, the local name for a Bigfoot-like creature that's been reported throughout the mountains and forests of Virginia. Others might wonder if it was something entirely different, an unknown animal, a trick of the moonlight, or something that simply hasn't been identified. Whatever it was stood silently in knee-deep water before sunrise, turned to look directly at John, and disappeared into the woods. More than a decade later, he still can't explain what he saw. Please let us know if you have any thoughts or ideas. I'll be sharing a link to this story with John. Something whispered his friend's name in the middle of nowhere. The person who shared the story wanted to remain anonymous, so all names have been changed to protect their identities. Luke and his two friends, John and Andy, hiked about 1.5 miles into Wall Lake in Utah's Uinta Mountains for a camping trip. They picked a secluded spot on the east side of the lake. They fished all day and spent the evening around the campfire before going to sleep around 11. Luke's tent sat near a rocky ledge. John slept in a hammock about 20 yards away, and Andy's tent was roughly 100 yards farther down the shoreline. At exactly 1:39 a.m., Luke woke up to what sounded like a man talking just outside of his tent. The voice was only about 30 feet away, but it wasn't speaking actual words. It was just gibberish. He listened, frozen, then everything went completely silent. He convinced himself it had been a dream and eventually drifted back to sleep. About an hour later, he was jolted awake again. This time, something let out a deep guttural call less than 2 feet from his head. It repeated the call in sets of 5, first beside Luke's tent, then only a couple of seconds later, Andy, then seconds after that, John's hammock. Whatever it was moved incredibly fast. Then came the footsteps. Heavy footsteps. Rocks kicked across the ground. Twigs snapped under something large as it walked straight to Luke's tent and stopped. It stood there. Luke was so terrified he couldn't move. He said he was lying there in tears of fear, completely frozen. From about 2:30 until 5:15 that morning, the thing circled their campsite. It wasn't just talking. It was talking in strange mumbles, making ear-piercing calls, screeching, knocking on trees, and slamming against them throughout the night. Luke hid under his sleeping bag every time he sent satellite text messages to his girlfriend, so the light from his phone wouldn't give away his position. When the sun finally came up around 7:30, he forced himself outside to check on his friends. Before Luke could even explain what happened, John said, "It was standing over my hammock." He said he couldn't see outside his sleeping bag, but he could feel something staring down at him. Then he said something that shook Luke even more. He claimed the voice was whispering in mumbles, but clearly said his name. Around 3:30 that morning, John had grabbed a flashlight and quickly scanned the woods. He never saw anything, but Luke remembered that exact moment. The instant the flashlight came on. What scares him most isn't what he heard, it's that whatever was out there somehow knew John's name. What happened out at Wall Lake isn't an isolated incident. This specific patch of the high Uintas, bordered by the eerie abandoned grounds of Camp Steiner, is infamous among locals for this exact brand of psychological terror. For decades, hikers in these woods have reported the Oz effect, a sudden suffocating silence where the forest goes dead quiet, followed by an overwhelming dread of being watched from the tree line. But it's the voices that truly connect to the deeper lore of these mountains. Local Native American folklore speaks of the Pa'apiks, or water spirits, that mimic human speech and whisper names from the dark to lure people away from safety. Combined with generations of reports detailing massive bipedal shadows pacing campsites and shaking tents, Wall Lake has earned its reputation as a place where the barrier between our world and something much older is terrifyingly thin. They were lucky they left when they did, because in the Uintas, when the forest whispers your name, it means something has already found you. I think these guys made the right decision leaving when they did. So what do you think was outside their campsite that night? And how could it have known John's name? Let me know your theories in the comments. Something outside their tent copied them and then circled them until sunrise. The woman who shared this story wanted to remain anonymous, so we'll call her Julie. In July of 2024, Julie and 4 of her cousins camped on private family land in Middle Tennessee, a place they'd visited many times before. Getting there wasn't easy. After leaving town, they drove about 10 miles down a rough gravel road, parked at the dead end, then hiked nearly a mile through dense woods. On one side of the trail was a steep, heavily wooded hillside with old horse trails. On the other side was a sharp drop toward a quiet cove off a popular lake. Their campsite sat on a flat patch beside the water, with nothing behind it but forest climbing up the hill. The day was completely normal. They swam, relaxed, cooked dinner over the fire, and let Julie's dog roam around the camp. As darkness settled in, small rocks started tumbling down the hillside behind them. At first they assumed it was a deer or some other animal moving through the brush, but whatever it was kept pacing back and forth, rustling through the trees and slowly getting closer without ever showing itself. One of Julie's cousins picked up a hatchet and lightly tapped it against a rock. Tap, tap, tap. The woods instantly went silent. Julie said the temperature seemed to drop almost 10 degrees. Then, from somewhere in the woods, tap, 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 the exact same rhythm came back. The group argued about hiking out, but the trail was long, overgrown, and completely dark. They decided it was safer to stay put. They all climbed into a large 12-person tent with Julie's dog. For a few minutes, everything felt normal again. Then they heard it. Just outside the tent, muffled voices. It sounded like men quietly having a conversation, but none of the words were understandable. Julie's dog, who normally barked at everything, stayed perfectly still and completely silent. Eventually, someone looked outside. There was no one there. Julie drifted off to sleep until one of her cousins gently shook her awake. The voices had returned. This time the moonlight revealed a dark figure standing outside the tent. Not enough to make out details, just a shadow. She quietly woke another cousin, pointed toward it, and everyone lay frozen. The figure began slowly circling the tent, round and round. Sometimes it came so close they could hear it brushing against the tent walls. It continued circling for hours until the first light of sunrise. Only then did someone finally look outside. Whatever had been there was gone. Nothing had been stolen and nothing had been disturbed. They convinced themselves it had probably been a coyote or maybe a large cat investigating the camp. As for the voices, maybe they were hearing people talking from boats out on the main channel of the lake. It all had to have a normal explanation. They stayed one more day. But as evening approached, everyone seemed to feel the same quiet urgency. Without saying much, they packed the camp almost like they were racing the sunset. Then it happened. From the woods behind them came a scream so loud it echoed across the cove. Julie said it sounded both human and animal at the exact same time. They didn't wait around to investigate. They left immediately. To this day, she still has no idea what made that sound. Some people say the rock throwing, the pacing around the campsite, and the figure circling the tent resembles stories of Tennessee's wood booger, a regional name for Bigfoot. Others point to Cherokee traditions about forest beings known for mimicking human sounds, throwing small rocks, or making muffled conversation just beyond sight. And that final scream has even been compared to old Tennessee legends like the mysterious White Bluff Screamer. Whatever Julie and her family encountered, they never went looking for answers. So what do you think was outside Julie's tent that night? Please leave comments below. They only saw it for 1 second, but they never forgot it. The person who shared the story wanted to remain anonymous, so we're going to call him Lee. A few years ago, Lee and his friend Jay spent nearly every weekend hiking through the massive state forest behind Jay's childhood home in upstate New York. The woods stretched for miles, with a large pond near the center and steep hills deep inside the forest. One summer day, they hiked a couple of miles in, stopped at the bottom of a steep hill, and ate lunch on a fallen tree. As they stood up to continue, they both froze. Standing halfway up the hill was a towering brown humanoid figure, at least 7 or 8 feet tall. In its right hand was something metallic that caught the sunlight. The moment it realized they'd seen it, it exploded into motion, not running or walking. It became a blur and vanished into the trees in a split second. Lee looked at Jay. Jay looked at Lee. At the exact same time, they asked, "Did you see that?" What made it even stranger was that neither of them could clearly describe the creature. It was almost as if the figure itself was out of focus, while everything else in the forest was perfectly sharp. The only details they both agree on were that it was incredibly tall, brown, and it was carrying something shiny, and it was impossibly fast. They immediately turned around and headed home. About a week later, curiosity got the better of them. They returned, climbed the same hill, and found no tracks or signs of anything unusual. But a few minutes later, deep in the woods, they stumbled across a rotting wooden shed with no windows, and part of the roof collapsed. Inside were only a few old tools. They never saw the figure again. To this day, Lee and Jay still call it Bigfoot, but they have no idea what they actually witnessed. So what do you think they saw? Bigfoot or something else hiding in those New York woods? Please leave a comment. I'm going to share a link to this video with Lee. I really feel like 2026 has been the summer of Bigfoot. There have been so many stories and sightings, it really makes you wonder. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you for spending part of your night with me. I truly appreciate every one of you. Now, I want to hear from you. Which story stuck with you the most? Do you think these witnesses encountered Bigfoot? Was it another known animal or something we still don't understand? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you've had a strange encounter of your own, whether it involves Bigfoot, cryptids, the paranormal, or anything unexplained, I would love to feature your story in a future episode. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who loves a good mystery. It really helps the channel grow, and it allows me to keep bringing these stories to life. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and I'll meet you again at midnight.